Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Memento Mori Fight Club. We are here with Bishop Michael Sis from the Diocese of San Angelo. Bishop, how you doing?
Fine. It's good to be with you guys, and I'm so glad that you're doing this broadcast.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We're in Madrid on the Feast of St. Dominic. So, Bishop, today, thank you for joining us to talk a little bit about your own experience of suffering. So, the question we want to ask you is, how do you personally process suffering in your own life?
We all have our share of suffering, and I've had my share of suffering. And there are certain lessons that I've learned over the years on how to face suffering as a Catholic Christian. And I think one of the greatest gifts of our Catholic faith is how we as Catholics process suffering. It's profound. And for example, a good starting point is that in my suffering, I lean on others. I have to humbly accept the help of others when I'm going through my pain and my suffering. It's an experience of the virtue of humility and solidarity with others when others reach out and help, and when I'm going through a time of suffering. And it's a reminder to us as Catholic Christians that we're not alone. Our experience of life, of faith, of God is with others. And so in my experience of suffering, I allow myself to be helped. And I get by with a little help from my friends.
Is there a particular person in your life that really led you and kind of taught you how to enter into that?
Well, I would say just my studies of our faith, Scripture and our tradition, the spiritual experts in our faith have taught me that through suffering, we must allow ourselves to be helped. And there's a grace in that. No particular person that comes to my mind.
Any particular scripture passage that's your go-to, or that you've gone to several times throughout your life?
Yeah, in terms of Scripture and suffering, there's certain passages in Scripture that help me to make sense out of my suffering. And one of them is the Scripture passage of Jesus in his Passion, where he's carrying his cross, and at a certain point, Simon of Cyrene comes and helps him carry his cross. That's a beautiful image for how we need to process our suffering. Jesus was in need. He was suffering, and Simon helped him. And Jesus allowed himself to be helped, and Simon was blessed by being able to help the Lord in his suffering. And then other aspects of suffering that make sense to me are how in my suffering I open myself up to God more. When I'm going through a hard time, it's an opportunity for me to open myself up to the grace of God and to lean on God more. When I was in college, I went on a retreat that was guided by Henry Nouwen, who was a Catholic priest from the Netherlands. And it was a college student retreat, and I was attending it. This was many years ago. And he used this image for leaning on God. He had this image of a boulder, and leaning on that boulder as an image for how we must lean on God. The solidness of that boulder sustains us in our suffering. And that image has always stuck with me. That's what I do with God when I'm going through a hard time. Like, for example, in November of 2020, when I had a really serious case of COVID, I was leaning on God, just leaning into His grace. And He carried me through. And it was a real blessing. So the whole idea of the cross is very important for us in processing suffering. We allow the Lord to help us carry our cross. We help Him carry His cross. And we suffer with the Lord. Okay, so some people, when they suffer, they experience their suffering as alienating them from God. But in my suffering as a Catholic Christian, my suffering draws me into a more intimate relationship with God, in communion with Him, because God suffered on the cross. And when I suffer, I unite my suffering with His on the cross, and I get closer to Him, and He gets closer to me. There's a stronger communion with Jesus through my suffering. That's a powerful experience for me as a Catholic Christian. Another aspect of suffering that helps me and others to process it is how our suffering becomes redemptive. There's a beautiful passage from Colossians where Paul says, "In my affliction, I'm making up for what is lacking in the suffering of Christ." And a lot of people ignore that passage because they can't make sense out of it. But when we suffer and unite our suffering with the experience of Christ on the cross, we are extending His experience of His redemptive suffering on the cross through time, into our time and place. And so my suffering, united that way with the suffering of Jesus, becomes redemptive suffering. His suffering was redemptive. He paid the price for human sin. But when I unite my suffering with His, I also am helping to pay the price of my own sin and the sins of others by uniting my experience with His. We become God's co-workers, even in our suffering. And that is so profound. It's a distinctly Catholic insight based on pure Scripture, but a lot of other Christians never get that. But it's such a grace in our Catholic faith to see how my suffering actually has redemptive value for the souls of other people. And it's an awesome privilege. Another thing that my suffering does for me, when I'm suffering or when I'm accompanying another person in their suffering, is that it gives me an opportunity to become a more compassionate human being. Because one who has suffered is much more capable of loving compassionately others who suffer. One time there was this wise old priest who worked in a seminary. And somebody asked him, "Monsignor, what would you do to make a good holy priest?" And he says, "I would break his heart." Because when our hearts are broken and we experience God's compassion, then we become more compassionate. And when we walk with another person who's suffering and we patiently stand by their side and we're just there with them in their suffering, we grow in the virtue of compassion. And we need to be more compassionate. And suffering opens up millions of opportunities for us to become more compassionate human beings. And our world needs us to be more compassionate. So those are just a few things in my own experience as a Catholic Christian that help me and others to make sense out of suffering.
I guess going back to compassion, how would you turn that compassion to yourself? Yes, we experience compassion to others when we help them through suffering, but what about compassion to ourselves?
Oftentimes we're too hard on ourselves, and we expect so much out of ourselves that we don't accept our own limits. And by accepting God's compassion humbly, then we can allow God to love us. And because God is loving and accepting to us, that can help convince us to be more loving and accepting of ourselves. And if a human being is going to be well-adjusted and at peace with this life, they've got to be able to be compassionate and loving to themselves as well.
Thank you, Bishop. That was really good insight.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Fidel. And I hope that more people will come and interview with you so that more people watching your channel can come to a deeper understanding of the gift of suffering and what a redemptive, saving blessing it is for us.
Absolutely.
Praise be Jesus Christ.
Now and forever.
Thank you guys for joining us for this episode of the Memento Mori Fight Club.
Keep fighting the good fight.